Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit. It is a sunny February. It's pretty cold, and we are literally one white man down. Johannes is unfortunately sick with something really in February. You never know what it is. But thankfully, still had the spontaneity to jump into a call and record a second episode about artificial intelligence with us. Specifically, we're talking artificial intelligence in general, but more specifically, the open source kind and the European kind. And I think there are a lot of interesting intersections in this one as well. So thank you, Axel, for doing a follow-up to, or a deeper follow the rabbit kind of thing with us.
It's an absolute pleasure.
It will be a little bit nerdy, but at the same time, we hope that this conversation really expands your understanding of what is possible with open source solutions today. And while it is nerdy, there are certainly aspects about this that small scenarios that we imagine are going to be really relevant in the coming years for European contexts specifically. Small recap maybe of the first episode, if you haven't listened to it. Although we would recommend you listening to the first episode in the series before diving into this one. But for those who are, not ready to invest 2 hours, we started out a conversation in the last episode with a DeepSeek and how it introduced basically this, to wider audience, to more like pop cultural kind of audience, the fact that there are open source opportunities out there. It's not actually quite true because Meta was releasing Llama and it was open source before that, but DeepSeek kind of gained that kind of public space and introduced a lot of people to the idea that LLMs aren't just something that you use through OpenAI or Anthropic. It's something that you can potentially run on a local machine. And there are multiple ways of doing that for people who are not that inclined to go into the deeper weeds of doing local installations, stuff like LM Studio that allows people to experiment locally without, knowing everything about technology right out of the bat. Then we kind of discussed the individual and organizational implementation level. So we kind of looked at what can I run on my machine? Like, if I have just a MacBook Pro, what can I actually run on it? What are some use cases? And then kind of discuss ideas for SMBs and which we'll kind of pick up today again as well. And one really crucial component of the conversation about this for us is the European context. So Europe lags in certain developments in terms of AI. A lot of those kind of conversations have been manifested in the AI summit last week in Paris. And for a small recap, because he was very closely tuned into the developments there, Axel, can you give us a recap of what happened at the AI summit and what you found to be really interesting?
It's an absolute pleasure. And repeating here, I think the last time we said, hey, let's do another round in roughly 6 months. And I was like, hey, AI, the AI world is actually turning quite quickly. I didn't expect it as quickly that we would see each other, but it's a pleasure. And let's start with what has happened in Paris during last week. And first, the first fact is, since we talked heavily about the importance of open source AI models, this basically reflected at that conference as well, because the European Union is obviously going straight into that direction. So our hypothesis wasn't as wrongly, I suppose. On the other hand side, I think a lot of people read the amount of money that the European Union wants to invest within the decade, and it's actually 200 billion. 200 billion, and let's split that a little bit up on what that means exactly and where does the money come from, is actually quite a significant amount, I suppose. And a lot of people showed, at least at the sources that I read, a very positive reaction on that. So in detail, it splits actually, of course, into the private sector and into the public sector. And it was interesting to see that roughly, I think, 150 billion out of the 200 within the decade come from the private sector. And there is an initiative called Invest AI, which is the umbrella initiative under Ursula von der Leyen, that is responsible for the whole package, basically. But on the other hand side, there are the EU AI Champions initiative on the private sector side, as I said, 150 billion roughly. And as you would expect, there all the relevant key players of Europe. It doesn't matter if it's Novo Nordisk, if it's something like BMW or BNP Paribas, etc. Both basically contribute to that amount that gets invested over time. Of course, this is not something that they did suddenly during the week. This is, of course, investments that they planned on AI in particular over the years already since probably a longer time. And I should also mention that was, I think, Igor, an interesting fact, because a huge sum out of the 150 million comes from an investment from UAE, and it was given to Macron, actually made that deal. And it's basically more, I would say, a French-focused investment, of course, with a benefit for the European Union. And it's about investing into data centers out of France. And I think it's OM Cloud as a provider who is involved in that. So with 113 million, that's a huge chunk actually of the money that goes into that. Let me just follow up on the 50 million, which comes from the European Union. And it's basically a super collector of 3 larger initiatives that are already running, not always necessarily only focused on AI. One of them, I think, is Digital Europe, which is a little bit broader than just artificial intelligence. And the huge announcement was, as a continuation of something that they announced more silently last year, is that roughly 25 billion will be invested into so-called AI gigafactories. So not to confuse with the gigafactories from Musk or so, but the branding is kind of similar. So that's a huge investment, and they announced in December last year already a couple of spots within Europe where those AI gigafactories will be. For instance, they are close to a German university, and this is one of the gigafactories, and a lot of other research entities, more in a university context. I was surprised about that, which will be the ones that they have chosen as AI gigafactories. So in December, they announced 9. And now they said I think it's 4 more that they're going to announce, but it's not clear where they are exactly at. Considering that, that was a huge insight for me, at least, that they are not building on top of market players within the different regions, but instead build upon universities. And besides that, there was also an interesting fact, also for the next questions that we're going to raise, or discussion points, which is basically that they want to equip every AI gigafactory with 100,000 dedicated GPUs. And there are not that many on this planet, I have to admit. Maybe that's worth doing a deeper dive. But of course, there's NVIDIA as a key player, as the key player globally. But on the other hand side, I'm not sure how familiar you are with what's going on in China in terms of data centers. And there are companies which are more or less hidden, like Moore's Threads, like Moore's Law. And they got an investment of 500 billion in lately overall Series B round. And they basically are a key competitor to what NVIDIA is doing as GPUs and dedicated chips. And they're the ones who are also now implementing DeepSeek, basically, which is an interesting counterpart to what NVIDIA is doing. Because in Europe, we don't have a GPU manufacturing or a brand or a company who does that so far. But there are also movements now in that front, but let's go piece by piece. I just wanted to repeat the overall amount, the 200 billion, and how it splits. Lastly, maybe that's the last point. So just to mention here that to compare that with an investment side from the US when it comes to AI, I think Amazon themselves, they announced that they're going to invest, I think it's even within this year, 100 billion on AI. And if you bring together Alphabet, which is basically Google, Meta, and the big players, Microsoft, they invest, I have a concrete number, 320 billion this year. So again, just to put that in comparison, those few large players, obviously 320 billion this year, while the European Union will invest 200, which is a huge amount within the decade. But yeah,
Yeah, I
just
mean, the disparity in investment capability is, I think, a very noticeable, like it was noticeable long before that. People were comparing the R&D capacities of big brands or companies in Europe with the R&D capacity of an Amazon a long time before. But as time progresses, we are seeing a more and more bigger gap between just those capacities. And I think that in itself is a problem, obviously, and one that is being discussed on various levels, both on like national security level and other levels as well. And I think it would be fair to say that, I mean, even during the Biden administration, there was like a very big tension around the idea of allowing China to compete in AI and the perceived notion that this is a national security threat. I think the same goes for the European Union as well. As you have mentioned, I think the 200 billion are also a little bit of an aggregate of investment capacities that were planned before, that were aggregated into a press release kind of thing where it sounds good and it's not insignificant, but it's also not something that was put on top of the developments that have been already in place. What is interesting to me in this notion that that's not necessarily a critique. There's high complexity in even the setups that are discussed here. I think like reading through some of the material, the setups between those universities, getting like corporate donors and kind of participants on top, just reading about the setup that the European Union sees makes you a little bit dizzy in terms of all the complexity versus the ability of, say, a company like Anthropic to make product decisions that benefit it. And so it's not just money, it's also the speed with which that money is being spent that comes into this. But a huge problem in that conversation is that in a way, the European Union's answer is that we'll be competing head to head with approaches that we can't really do here. And there are alternatives to this that are being overlooked in a way, not necessarily on the execution level, but to the very least on the communication level, as to seeing how can we actually strengthen the position of SMBs in Europe in general, because SMBs are still, even in Germany and other countries, contributing about 50% to the GDP, and certain states more than others a little bit less, but still they're a huge contributor to the GDP. And at least on the messaging level, on the giving them agency level, there's not enough being done to support those companies to hit above kind of like their pay grade. In a way, the communication favors the concentration of capital, even on a European scale. And I think that's a problem. And I think like some of the things that we discussed in the last episode and some of the things that we want to discuss today are kind of centered around this idea of what is it that SMBs can actually do, and how easy is it going to be for them to adopt this? How much technical knowledge do owners or leaders in SMBs need to have to understand what is required? How do I start asking the right questions? It's not about really finding solutions. And I think like some of the glimpses that we discussed last time, but also some of the things that a company like NVIDIA is releasing through their Chart RTX box that kind of like is like basically like your mini supercomputer to run LLMs. Dollars as an entry point isn't low, but considering the fact that your average MacBook Pro doesn't cost that much less, it's actually not that much money. And from an investment point of view for a small company, that's totally feasible. And if you have this ability to invest 3K into hardware that will allow you to run local LLMs that are open source, compliant with European law, and allowing you to do, well, not maybe the same thing as you can do in ChatGPT, but like it is sufficient for your needs as a company, it becomes a different conversation. I think that's kind of like, for me, the misalignment from the European side, that There is no communication that drives that development.
And to differentiate even more and build upon what you said, I mean, if we talk about SMBs, we have to clarify. I think an SMB like the 10,000 plus, or that's even maybe too large SMBs, this is not what we're talking about, because they might be, even from a European perspective, they might be covered very well. I mean, we talked about scenarios of data centers for research, I mean, driven by universities where you can train as a startup, maybe train upon those research centers and so on for research entities themselves, so out of universities. Then on the other hand side, we now have for the SMBs, which are the larger players, I would say, you have corporations now with AMD. They basically bought a Finnish startup. I have to look up the name. It's something called Silo AI. And they're now partnering, I don't know if you know that, with Aleph Alpha. And Aleph Alpha was already with huge investments into the company as a German AI company, which was very early on, quickly moving, besides Mistral out of France. They had as investors SAP and the Schwarz Group, which is basically Lidl and so on for people outside of Germany. But I think for larger corporations or SMBs, not corporations, SMBs, there will be a very new and interesting structure. When we talk about SMBs, we are rather talking about really the backbone, at least from a German perspective. It's maybe like 5 people up to 30 or 40 or 50. And it would be a question, by the way, already, do you need as many people with a very small company in the future? Because you could simplify some processes driven or supported by AI, which is already a tricky question. But just to put a number against when we talk about SMBs and that experience. And then the question is, as you said, is that the kind of backbone, at least from a German perspective, that is supported well enough when it comes to AI, and what are the daily struggles in both regards?
Well, I mean, yes, let's put it this way. I think we're probably not going to discuss what will happen if certain AI timelines manifest themselves as perpetrated, like basically set by AI companies, and how many people will we actually need in employment. That in itself is something for another episode and a whole different conversation. From a modeling point of view, for the conversation that we're kind of talking, we're looking at companies, as you said, as they are right now. And at least my thesis is that a 10-people company can, with the right application and usage of AI, punch above its weight, and like properly above its weight these days. And I think there is this gap between the capacity to invest in certain kind of features and certain activities that SMBs were often not able to do because of A, money, and B, time. So there is a component to it where even if they're aware that they could be doing something, there was just no way for them to do this in comparison to bigger players. And that kind of like already limited their ability to operate. So for us, this is about, as you mentioned, like 5 to even 100 people companies where there are millions of them across Europe. They are both in manufacturing sectors as well as service sectors. They are being crushed by lots of different regulations that on the one hand can be sensible, but at the same time also make the life of those companies really hard because they do not have compliance teams to do this. They have to pay their lawyers that are not in-house to make sure that they're complying with all the regulations that are in place. And again, while a lot of those regulations have a point and have a sensibility and at least have the right intention, the reality is that they do make life really hard for those small companies. I think like AI, LLMs, and open source are a really interesting way of how to deal with a lot of those issues. But maybe to kind of break it down a little bit also from an individual level in a sense. I mean, we started talking about open source LLMs and AI stuff since last year. You helped me, find a llama, and I installed it. And I mean, I installed, for example, last week, something that mimics basically on an open source level what Perplexity released with their deep search. Also, it's kind of funny that ChatGPT, Google, and Perplexity all released kind of the same feature, and all of them named it deep search. I guess they're running out of words or something. But the process of doing this isn't straightforward. It it is very like similar to, if someone is interested in Linux and then they realize what it actually means to install Linux, they're like, well, maybe not so much. And I think a lot of the...
And let me ask in between, sorry, but I mean, repeating here, it's not like using a paid service and it works out of a box somehow. We're talking here about that you install something, that you run something locally. Please listen again to the last episode. But on the other hand side, I would have asked you, it wasn't as easy, or?
No, it absolutely wasn't. But and that's the interesting part for me is I'm a researcher and a strategist. I'm not a developer. I mean, I used to run a long time ago Linux on my notebook, so I have some familiarity with those systems, and I'm not scared when I see an instruction that says open up your terminal, which I'm assuming that most Mac users have never done in their life.
Seen.
Yeah, it's like, what is that? Well, it's installed on every Mac. You can just type it into Spotlight, open it up, and close it down again. The point here is really the entry into this world is a little bit difficult. But to me, I just used ChatGPT when something didn't work. Like, I just asked a really big kind of like service, like LLM, to help me bug fix what it was not working. And I think just the fact that I can do that the fact that I without any development skills, created a lot of custom code for my own website, shows you that there are a lot of like downstream capabilities arriving into the hands of people who have no way of acquiring those skills in an appropriate amount of time.
But this is very interesting what you said, because I remember last time we were talking about like, how is it that what we could give as an advice for everybody listening to start with, and basically you used the system itself, which is an AI that you used, a different one to solve an issue with another AI to basically install something without the knowledge or clear knowledge in detail, as you said. But that's very interesting, because it reflects also when we said last time, it's great to just start, to not hold back, and to try things out and dare to do so. So did I understand correctly that it was then helpful to you? Because sorry, I disrupted you, but I suppose you got it running with the support of an AI.
Yeah, I did. I mean, ChatGPT helped me replace ChatGPT kind of in a way, which is irony in and on itself. But I think that's kind of also the point. There, like whatever tricks you can use these days. I mean, Johannes mentioned it last episode. There are plenty of YouTube videos that go along. So in a way, what we're also trying to do in this episode is lower the bar, like allow people to think that they can actually do this, because they can actually do this. Yes, most of the things that are being published about, installing like deep search Olama is written in a way that is fairly technical, and it doesn't consider, like, it's not written for people who don't understand anything about this. But to be honest, I did kind of like, I export, like you sent me this Medium link that describes what it does, to give you a very kind of clear journey. What I did is start installing it. When I kind of bumped into a problem, I exported this article as a PDF and put it into ChatGPT, and to give it context what I'm trying to do. And when I was running basically into problems inside of my terminal, I would just give it like basically the output of the terminal, copy and paste it, and tell it, well, it's not working. And it would provide me with step-by-step approaches of how to solve this. Because I gave it the article, it knew what I'm actually trying to do. And at the same time, I gave it code, not code, the output of the terminal. And for that, in an hour or so, I had this thing running, which, to be honest, like, I would not have been able to do, because often the problem with technical hiccups is that you can theoretically, you can Google for them, but you need to know what to ask for. With LLMs, you kind of don't need to know exactly what you're asking for. It will interpret your problems and provide solutions.
And reflecting here, I mean, we talked about those small companies and the ecosystem that they have. I mean, on the one hand side, of course, they have their IT or even outside IT departments, which help them on their daily tasks. I think this is not going to change as a whole. In detail, it does, because they have to have that knowledge again. And the question is, how do they educate themselves on what's happening on AI? Because a couple of things that maybe they took care of can be solved now by the user. I mean, probably not as extreme as you said. Sovereignty is definitely a thing here. And so the role of maybe those small IT companies, besides educating themselves, which is important, the question is how to roll that out on a larger level, because we are talking about a huge amount of companies Europe-wide, is so crucial. And we heard numbers. I think there was a hint by Ursula von der Leyen before, that the percentage of European companies using AI is like 6 or 7 or so percent, or it was even less. I can't recall it out of my head.
How would they measure that?
That's again another question, and what counts in. I mean, if you use ChatGPT privately, you probably have contributed or benefited from it. Anyway, it's a small number in comparison to numbers from other regions in the world. But the question is, how do we actually feed that ecosystem? But the use case that you have given, I mean, this is a technical use case still, right? But as we all know, not everybody, that's at least what I learned over years, can read an annual report. And I'm sure if you just upload an annual report of whatever company, you could have a wonderful analysis, or you can turn it into a forecast or so, things that are missing through the help of an AI. And I'm not saying that everything will be correct or so, but we're definitely getting there. And it's things that you have some self-independence also. And those are very simple use cases, actually, that would be a benefit for everybody.
Yeah, and I would argue that experimenting with AI just generally to understand what it actually does and how it can be potentially helpful to an individual or an SMB, as we discussed, that's still something that's probably better done inside of the existing kind of cloud services, because it's just so easy to get an understanding of what you can be doing with this. Mm-hmm. But when it becomes more operational, there's obviously a discussion about the fact, well, what am I willing to share with those larger systems, not just on a kind of regulatory level, but also on the question of how much do I want to contribute to them learning from my data to extend their capabilities and basically make me more dependent on them in the future. I think there is a component or a scenario that I kind of like wanted to discuss is like, and you kind of touched already upon this, like, are we going to see the reemergence of like small IT firms that are basically there not to just build your website? Maybe they will not even build websites at some point, because nobody will actually need an external partner to build a website for them. But maybe they will be installing and maintaining, well, more or less boxes that run local LLM, open source, Europeanly funded, with the ability to also contribute to a larger goal of understanding how economies of scale can actually operate when they are distributed. I think there are a lot of components here that are
I could give
definitely
you
not.
I could give you an example, what you just said, because I mentioned before Aleph Alpha and the initiative with AMD and so on. I know that Aleph Alpha, they announced that they want to concentrate upon a dedicated operating system called Thuraya. And this is an example, but it's for government institutions, so it's not for SMBs. But just think about, because you talked before about a cloud service and so on. Of course, that's one possibility. On the other hand side, if we have an operating system where everything is already configured and ready-made for usage with AI, that could be a layer that is, from a simplicity factor, interesting also for everybody else. And to be more precise, and I try to keep it as easy as possible, there are solutions right now, there are operating systems available, which themselves, you can't change them, you can't install something there. So you have all the basic components in there, but on top, you can bring layers that focus upon specific services. To simplify it, let's say you are someone who's producing media. Then you have on top every layer already installed to cut your videos, to post to your social media accounts and so on. And it's not fantasy what I'm talking about. It's really something that is already existing, and it comes out of Europe. And they, by the way, this approach, the operating system in that case is called Bluefin. And they now have this container layer on top dedicated to AI. So it has a whole development environment in that case with everything set up, your Visual Studio Code, your coding tools for CUDA, if you are in machine learning and so on. It's all pre-configured. And you can interchange it. The same system provides also a layer for gaming. So you have all your gaming interface for Steam or whatever on top. I'm just saying, hey, this is a solution from an operating system perspective where everything can be pre-configured, that it's ready to go. And you would be surprised if we now talk about the small IT companies. I mean, it's basically setting up a couple of configuration files. It's not as complicated, and it's easy, and you have that layer, and it's tailor-made and ready-made for a small company. Yeah. And I think this is something... Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I think the first example that you kind of showed me was the Nextcloud, right? Also European funded suite of basically office tools that would be used as an alternative to Microsoft Office 365. So it's cloud-based, it's locally installed, and basically
comes with AI support as well.
Now, exactly, like it now already comes out of the box with AI support. Still, I think what's interesting to me is that from a customer point of view, if you run a small business and you have the option between using Nextcloud and you have the option using Microsoft Office 365, I don't know the exact number, but I would assume that 9 out of 10 people are deciding to use Microsoft's products because first of all, I think they assume it's easier, which is probably not even doing. And I think they assume that the maintenance of those products is too hard for them to understand. There are a lot of other issues, I think, at hand. So basically, from a customer point of view, I think there is this perceived notion that those systems are too complex to actually acquire, despite the fact that running such a system is significantly cheaper for a small business, because if you're using Microsoft 365 with AI, I think it's like 30 euros a month with per employee, which is not an insignificant amount. So there are I think we have actually out of the box solutions that would not need necessarily a lot of maintenance. We need to start telling more of the stories that with the help of AI, those systems are becoming increasingly sufficient to replace the current ecosystem that most people are using.
That's a good point. I mean, on the one hand side, I remember I'm talking about cloud service, and even for small companies, we shouldn't underestimate. I think the first time that I worked on top of a cloud service was when Amazon launched Amazon Web Services. I think back then I was one of the first companies, or worked within one of the first companies where we built a product on top of.
As Axel saying, is very old.
Yeah, it is on the one hand side from an innovation standpoint. I would say, a lot of things happen, of course, every day in between with that product line. But cloud services like that, where you can build on top of those, or that you can just use, they exist since quite a while. But not only since I'm working within financial services. Barriers on using those services, cloud services, in particular, also with US vendors and so on, they're still a thing. They're still a huge thing. They're still complicated. A lot of people try to avoid it within the European context, but that's something to consider, what we're using. And we had the same discussion with DeepSeek in terms of the difference between downloading DeepSeek as an app and just use their cloud service, and on the other hand side, install it and use it locally, and you're in full control what goes in and out and so on in terms of data. So it's a double-edged sword, I would say. On the one hand side, it's easy to use. On the other hand side, data maintenance, data ownership, etc., but complexity. The thing that I had in mind with what I described with that operating system What is so good about cloud services is that they are always up to date, that they always work, and so on. This is fixed, by the way, with that example that I've given more or less, because it's like, how should I say? You don't have to install updates. It automatically updates. It's one release. I'm using it now for 1.5 years. I don't have a clue. You can roll back if something goes wrong. You press a button, it goes back to its default stage or previous stage, and does backups for you and so on. Still nerdy. I'm not neglecting that, but I think we're getting there. That it is basically both. But because we have to have something that covers both sides, simplicity, but also security in terms of data and ownership, and we're getting there, which is the blue pill that I would spread here. But yeah, we're not completely there.
No, we're not. But at the same time, I think these days the sovereignty of Europe is up for discussion quite significantly on a security level. And I think while everyone has a certain awareness of the fact that, using an American software solution comes with a downside. I mean, it's a utility curve kind of situation where, of course, it is much easier to start using this right today and kind of uploading certain files and be like, well, I'm not that important. Nobody will actually kind of read my files. And yes, to a certain extent, that's kind of true. But I think when people are going to vote on Sunday in Germany, they can also start voting with their technical decisions that seem maybe very complex, but and we don't want to downplay it. This is still a little bit of a nerdy area, but investing in it today, investing into opportunities today will definitely pay off, I think, because whether or not AI follows the same path as, Sam Altman and all those people are actually saying, I personally don't believe that we're kind of approaching AGI, but that's a whole different kind of conversation. What we can certainly say that AI as a kind of foundational technology, it's not going away anytime soon. And the sooner European solutions start re-emerging, and I think that's kind of like to maybe kind of steer down to conclusion. I think there are a lot of things already in play. There are a lot of kind of open source solutions already in play. And maybe bigger organizations will be actually start switching more to them. I wonder, for example, and we discussed this before the episode, why the European Union is kind of like so keen on developing everything from scratch. Despite the fact that, there are a lot of already open source solutions out there. Even if they're Chinese, they're still open source, and MIT license is an MIT license. So you can do with it whatever you want, pick up where they kind of left off. And make this a European version of DeepSeek or Llama, and focus more on enabling businesses and other organizations of using those solutions, because that feels like money better spent.
And you're right. I mean, the question is it's not for or against. It's basically both. And we said that also previously, that the huge benefit of some of the solutions out there are that you can choose, if you use, for instance, Open Web UI, between the different LLMs. And you can take a hosted one, a cloud solution, a locally hosted one, and you can even run them against each other where you get the best results. Also, in terms of a LLM, we have to develop our own LLM. I did some calculations, by the way, in terms of resources for those data centers that I mentioned in the beginning, the AI gigafactories. And I think just there was also a quote by a McKinsey report, and the energy consumption will triple in terms of AI. That's at the end also a question of, is that from an energy standpoint feasible? I'm purposely not saying sustainable, I'm saying feasible, that we can really provide that amount of energy. Yeah. That's one thing. But the other aspect is, I think, that is neglected. Let's say we build a truly independent LLM out of Europe, and it's fantastic and it's better and so on. I said it in the beginning. What about the GPUs that we're using? We're either heavily dependent on a US vendor, or on the other hand side, and you can't read a lot about it in the Western hemisphere, because they don't export also their GPU from China with more threads. Baidu, by the way, has a similar GPU that they're using for their data centers. That could be the other equivalent to NVIDIA. But again, we would be dependent either on the US or on China, because we don't have, at least I haven't heard about it. We're talking about LLMs, run and train them here out of Europe or build them out of Europe. But we're not talking about the manufacturing of GPUs and all its components that belong to that production line. Which is strange because you would make one thing, perfect is the wrong word, more or less independent, let's call it out like that. But on the other hand side, you would still be totally dependent.
Yeah, and I think it is likely that we will not solve all the problems in this podcast. But I do hope that the second episode especially kind of helps you to muster your courage and explore those things, really kind of look into different solutions. We'll also we linked into a few in the previous episodes. We'll definitely be linking to, Olama, Web UI, and all those things in this episode as well, so that there are entry points. Again, ask the closed LLMs to help you run the open ones. That's certainly a solution to a problem. I think it would be fair to say, Axel, that the European approach is, while interesting and with significant money, it kind of lacks on the one hand, the infrastructure problem that we require GPUs. So on a hardware level, we are kind of still dependent. And on the kind of like strategic political approach, it kind of also misses the point that there is an alternative to concentration of, on bigger companies that obviously require similar capabilities as other big companies in the world. But we need to also figure out how to address the issues that SMBs have in Europe and how to solve and help them just run solutions that will enable them to perform better, or at least equally so as today in the future.
And it's a huge opportunity for them as well. And we have to say that for those IT departments or small companies to embrace those new chances. And because there will be a huge demand, and it's not taken so far. So take that as something positive.
Certainly. And if you have questions, how to start, if the things that we're linked to aren't quite up there, definitely drop us a line. We'll help where we can, because we definitely want to see more of this happen. I still remember the days when I was like the only guy in the agency running Linux on the notebook, and I had to ask my colleagues to print something out because that wasn't working. And we're definitely farther down the line with those kind of like developments here. A lot of things are possible that you're not using today, and we encourage you to experiment. With that, thank you, Axel, for being both spontaneous and so deep into this material as you are, and contributing to Follow the Rabbit. We say goodbye and see you next week with a freshly remade Johannes on different topics other than AI. It will be quite a change. I can promise you that already. Thank you, Axel, again. See you soon.
Pleasure. See you.